Greetings, Corpse Clubbers, and welcome to another episode of Corpse Club, the official podcast for dailydead.com. My name is Heather Wixson, and today we are going to be celebrating all things Shirley Jackson for the release of Shirley, which hits this weekend. And I am so thrilled to be joined for our first interview with Sarah Gubbins, who is the writer of Shirley. I was so bummed to have missed this at Sundance, Sarah, so I'm really excited to speak with you today.
Oh, good. So glad to be here and talk all things Shirley. I like talking all things Shirley.
Yes. So I would love to hear a little bit because I can remember the first time I discovered Shirley Jackson was in junior high. And it was, of course, when because every kid in junior high reads the lottery.
Yep.
And I was completely fascinated by her. And I think after that, that's when I went out and took a copy of The Haunting of Hill House out of the library and just became really fascinated by this woman because I grew up loving horror, but I didn't see a lot of female voices represented. And I'm curious for you, like, what was sort of your introduction to Shirley, and how did that sort of fascination grow on your end?
Well, we had the same experience, although I think mine was sophomore year of high school. It was like American literature, and you're starting out and you're like, oh, okay, Edgar Allan Poe's cool, this guy's cool. And then you hit like Flannery O'Connor and your brain blows up, and then then you read this lottery and you're like, what just happened? Because she starts out and you're thinking like, oh, this is an oldie-timey story. This is kind of not that interesting. And then bam, you're hit with a rock. And that was just no spoilers alert if you haven't read the lottery. So I didn't give anything away.
I was going to give you props for your good pun use there.
Oh God, already with the dad jokes. But yeah, no. So and then I unlike you was kind of a Jane Austen brat and really into like the Bronte. So I didn't gravitate to horror. So I didn't even know that she was a horror writer for quite some time. And then when I was in college, we took this class. I was a theater major and insert like, theater nerd totally. But we took this class where I read We Have Always Lived in the Castle and performed it, like made a stage adaptation of it, which I think was really my first experience of adaptation. And it's always so daunting because you're working with, when you're working with great writing, you have to kind of maneuver through it, but and cut out some of the great parts, and and find ways to try not to screw it up too terribly in the adaptation. But I think that was when I really fell in love with Shirley Jackson because I was living in her language. I was actually speaking her words, and there's something about it that kind of like got in my cells. And then from there, I just started reading her. So, but it wasn't until reading Susan Merrell's book, Shirley, that I really did start thinking about writing a feature that was about Shirley herself. Because I had thought like, oh, maybe adapting one of her stories or maybe even a novel. But it wasn't until that I thought, oh, this is a really complicated woman who I think in many circles is only known for that lottery and in many ways, the lottery was just the beginning. And you can see that there's evidence of kind of her future work, but yeah, there's just so much more. And I think that a lot of people just stopped with the lottery, and unlike you, but and she does have a really big Haunting of Hill House audience. But there's a lot more to her.
Well, what's interesting is actually because I'd heard about this, and I'm a huge fan of Elisabeth's and Michael's as well. So for Sundance, I started reading like a collection of her short stories. There's like a few of them out there, and I thought was really interesting. Now seeing this movie in retrospect, like stories like The Bird's Nest or like Janice.
Yep.
It really seems to me that like for her, writing was this catharsis to work out some of her own things that she was dealing with, that she was felt. It almost feels like she was trapped by. And I'm curious, like, for you, was that sort of conscientious on your part? Because I think this movie really captures that frustration of being Shirley in that world.
Yes.
Because she's so much more brilliant than every other person that she's around.
Yes, she really is. I think it's very, I would imagine it's very difficult being the smartest person in every room you step into. And also, I think it's terrifying. I think it's, we would imagine it would feel great, but I think it feels lonely, and I think you feel like a freak, and I think you feel like you're missing something. You're missing a piece when in fact you just have a superpower. And but I love the bird's nest. I love that you mentioned it, and Janice too. But like that, you're right to point out that she often felt trapped. I mean, she was a known agoraphobic, but
yeah,
I think the writing was twofold, as it often is. I think the writing kept her alive in the world. I think she wrote in many ways to dispel some of those demons, but I also firmly believe it, you can see it in the film, but that the writing took a very big toll on her. I wonder sometimes, if Shirley wouldn't have liked to just had a different worldview,
yeah.
not always be able to see the terror in the mundane, the kind of menace that a postman can bring, or the ways in which a haberdasher can feel like a burglar, or but in a lot of her work too, and just interrupt me because I tend to talk a lot.
No, not at all.
A lot of her work, there's she has yearnings to leave and escape. So I think that there's this kind of quest for freedom that isn't even fully visualized or articulated, but and so there is, I think, a striving and an optimism in her work as well. And so I like to believe that as much as the writing is kind of a tortured web in many ways, it's also an arena for escapism and an alignment to that kind of desire that I think she wrestled with.
No, absolutely. And I mean, obviously you're being a writer as well. I think for a lot of us, when you're doing, when you're sort of immersing yourself in writing, I think, there's obviously this catharsis that we're all sort of looking for, I think, through our art.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious from your perspective, diving into this book, bringing it to life for a script. I mean, was there sort of a cathartic moment for you going through this? Because even though this is a story that's, obviously set decades prior, as I was watching it, it was like my frustration at like things that are going on these days that come through in this story. I was just like, Jesus, like, how are we still like,
right.
certain places like this where, you kind of get really frustrated. And I was just curious from your perspective, was there sort of that moment for you where you kind of had like that breakthrough?
Well, there's a couple of different kind of layers to that question. I think there's a deep relief when, my process of writing this movie was so screwy. I would never want to do it again. I read Susan Merrell's book, and then I went back and I read all of Shirley Jackson's writing, which is actually a lovely thing to do. And so started a relationship with Shirley through her writing. And then I thought about, it was almost like being a detective, like you have, instead of a dead body, you have this novel, and you're now trying to reconstruct what it might have been like to write that, and what you might have had, what Shirley might have had to go through in order to write it. And then there's the additional piece of the novel Hangs a Man is very loosely inspired by a real life event of a Bennington student that went missing in the Green Mountains. And so in some ways, these layers of excavation were there. And I think the moment of catharsis came for me, first of all, like when the script was finally done, and it took me a long time to write the script, frankly, because I was wrestling with so many different aspects of what the story could be. And then I think it was seeing Josephine Decker's Thou Wast Lovely and feeling like, oh, she's capturing something in this movie that I feel is also in Shirley's imagination. And she's brought it to the screen, and it's not just, there was some kind of alchemy. There was like, when you feel seen by somebody else's work, like you're like, yes, I get it. I get what you're doing. I get what you're feeling. And I felt like that was the moment of like, oh, not only is the script, written, that was a great moment. And then finding Josephine through her work and feeling like and then to have Josephine want to do this. And then there was the moment on set. There's two moments. One, when Michael walked out of wardrobe with his sweater vest and those glasses, and he just looked like Stanley. And the second was when Elisabeth Moss put on those glasses and stepped out. And I was shocked. I was like, we've gotten ourselves in some tricky magic here. We are practicing some dark arts, and so that too. And then just I think that watching one of those early dinner scenes and having them just lift the language off the page in a way that I could never have imagined. So that too was like, whew, phew, I think we're going to be okay. I think we might be making a movie.
That's excellent. And I'm curious, because you mentioned Josephine, who
yeah.
I'm a big fan of hers, was when you guys sort of came together for this project, did she then sort of go into the script and kind of start, working things with you? I mean, or was everything sort of what we see in the film now already there on the page when you guys started to collaborate?
It's funny, like I can't even conceive of what the percentage was, but like there were just moments, and I think she really mined the character of Rose and really pushed me further into some of the kind of interiority of Shirley's mind and how we could dramatize that. And so some of those nightmare daydreams, the kind of hauntings that the girl with the red dress eventually or the red coat kind of embodies. And she really brought another added layer of psychology to those aspects of the film. And so we worked together. She would have these ideas or she would have these responses, and it was never prescriptive. And we'd kind of talk about what it was, the feeling and what we were searching for. And sometimes it was a musicality and just the tempo and the pacing and the dramaturgy of the feature. And sometimes it was just an added layer of character exploration. And I would go off and put something in front of her, and it was really, honestly, it was a very trust-filled collaboration where we really had a mutual respect for each other's points of views and knew how additive the other's kind of ways of seeing could be to the enhancing the feature, making the film.
Well, I'm always really curious because I know we're getting close on our time together. But I'm very much, as somebody who also writes, but in a very different way. But I'm a big believer whenever you do something creative, whether it's writing, directing, acting, or anything like that. I believe that there's, obviously something of yourself that you put into that project. There's also something that you sort of take away from it as well. And I'm curious from your sort of experiences, going through this book, finding a way to translate it for the screen, what is sort of your biggest takeaway from your experiences, working on Shirley?
I think Shirley was, it's obvious when I say it because, of course, it's Shirley Jackson. Things are never what they seem. That was the thing for me to take away. Every time I sit down to write something, I have to go with a little bit of confidence that I've done it before, so I'll be able to do it again. But in essence, if you're not moving to a point of absolute terror that you're not going to be able to do it and it's not going to work, then you're not doing anything, I think, worth making. And I think that was true at so many points in this production, in the writing, in the editing. Like you always, there's this point of absolute like fear that it's not going to come together, and then. But being able to work through that is when the good shit happens. And I think Shirley just reiterated that we're not entirely in charge at all. And you can't, and I think it's really true in the way that she wrote the portrayal of how she wrote Hangs a Man. And in the ways that you really have to stay open and you have to stay brave in deep uncertainty. But when you have a team of people that can truly support the making of something, then it's okay. And it makes it easier. And I would just say, like, I remember this one, we were on a cliff, we were shooting the scene on a cliff and everything looked great. Everything looked great on the page. Everybody knew they loved the scene. It was a really tough day to get the whole crew up the cliff. We had very limited time. Everybody's in harnesses. Nobody's, we don't want anybody to get hurt. And we start the scene and I remember leaving Video Village, running to the set, and Josephine and Lizzie we were all huddled together and we kind of looked at each other and it's like, it's not working, and it was that moment we were literally on the cliff saying, all right, Elisabeth said, what if I did this? And Josephine was like, and do that. And I said, and maybe do this, and then that, and this, and that. And then we found something, and I think that's kind of an encapsulation of what I really, really, really learned. And I will undoubtedly have to learn it again.
Well, one quick last question before we wrap up, but I wanted to ask, from your research and everything you've done, what would be the one Shirley Jackson story that you would recommend to people that they may not have read or they may not have heard about, that you kind of came across and just completely fell in love with?
I love the short story of hers called Louisa, Please Come Home.
Yes.
I love that story so much. But if you have an appetite for something a little longer, and I would say read We've Always Lived in the Castle. That to me is just one of her finest pieces. And it's told from a very unreliable narrator's perspective. So it's so devilish.
Wonderful. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for chatting with me today about this film. I absolutely loved it. I can't wait for people to see it. And really, congratulations on everything. It was just absolutely incredible.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Well, have a great rest of your day, too.
Okay. You too. Stay safe.
All right, everybody. We are back for the second half of the episode where we're going to be celebrating the release of Shirley this weekend, as well as all things Shirley Jackson. And for this segment, I am joined by filmmaker Josephine Decker. Josephine, it is so great to speak with you today. Thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. I have to say, if I can geek out for a real quick second, I was a huge fan of Madeline's Madeline.
Wow.
So this is really exciting for me.
Yay. Oh, thank you. I'm glad. I'm so glad. That's a pretty wild film. It takes a special person to connect to that movie. So I like you already.
Wonderful. Well, it's funny because whenever I see somebody talking about it, like on Twitter or something, and I was like, I have found my people. So I know that's like one of those, like, people talk about like handshake movies. So I'm like, if somebody talks about that movie, I'm like, I know that they're cool and they're part of the club then.
Yes, right. Exactly. Amazing.
Well, first of all, congratulations on Shirley. I grew up a huge fan of Shirley Jackson's work, and I didn't really know much about her personal life, and I really loved what you were able to do with this project in particular, and of course the cast and, the amazing script that you had to work with. And I'm curious, was this something that was brought to you then? I'm just sort of curious as to how this initially sort of came to be in terms of your involvement.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah Gubbins had written an incredible script, and then I got to pitch on it. I was invited to pitch on it. So, so it was already pretty far along, and then I just got to sort of like ask for some magic and the magic entrance, password. I had to say the password, and then I got to go into the world of Shirley. So I was brought on once there was already written very, very awesome script.
Excellent. And I'm curious, had you been real familiar with Shirley and her works prior to this, or was this sort of an education in Shirley Jackson for you then? Mostly an education, although I had just read We've Always Lived in the Castle and really fallen in love with that work and felt like that was so,
it was kind of eye-opening just that it's so dark and yet so much fun, and it's sort of hinges and it lives in a kind of fairy tale-ish timeless land that is something that I think I've been really interested in for my own work. And so I was just newly obsessed with Shirley because I had really only known her from The Lottery when I got invited to pitch on this movie. I had just read We Have Always Lived on the Castle. And so then I dove deep into her work before I did the pitch. I read a bunch of her stories, read We Have The Haunting of Hill House. And then obviously over the next year, read also, her bios, the Shirley book, the bunch of her other works and stories and her memoirs. And so it was fun research. I mean, there's a reason this woman that we made a movie about her, because she's an epic, really talented writer who I also think is so fascinating because she wrote in such a timeless way. She wasn't, I remember her biographer saying like, she's not a political writer, but I think of her work in a way as being extraordinarily political because she was writing about these sort of timeless issues of, the female subconscious and maybe our own self-destructive tendencies. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting too, you sort of touched on this, and I'm curious if this is something that's sort of conscientious to you. When I read some of Shirley's short stories over the years, it feels very personal. It's sort of like it's this glimpse into this woman who, was so much more than I think society was letting her be. Like she was able to be a really, successful writer, but I just get the sense, especially after seeing this film, like that there was more to Shirley than just her words. And there's like that sort of that internal struggle on her part to sort of be recognized as something, I don't want to say something more than a writer, but she was more than that, I think. And I think this film really addresses that in a very unique and very thoughtful way. And I'm curious from your perspective, because, as a female working in the industry, I mean, were there sort of parallels to the things that Shirley was, dealing with, 60 something years ago to the things that we're still dealing with now? Because I feel like we should be better about these things, about letting women's voices be heard. And yet we really aren't. And it's very frustrating.
Yeah, I think, I felt a definitely connection with Shirley as an artist and in a way with the questions inside the film. I think my last film, Madeline's Madeline, was sort of about how do women artists maybe use each other sometimes,
right.
Or like what are the subtle exploitations that we maybe do to each other, and then so I think I was already, there's thematic crossover with some work that I had already been kind of conjuring and pondering in terms of how Shirley uses Rose as sort of a muse / pathway to figure out the main character of Shirley's new novel. But I think also in terms of the identifying with her as an artist, I feel very fortunate to be in the position that I'm in right now as a woman working in Hollywood at this particular moment, like literally this year. I mean, everything was so different 5 years ago. And I think I was so, felt a little bit frustrated that the opportunities for women felt so different than the opportunities for men. And I was hearing that frustration echoed by, I think I went to see Catherine Hardwicke speak, and she was talking about how, there was this kind of ceiling. She made Twilight and she, made tons and tons of money and then couldn't get her next job. And she was just like, it wasn't, she's like, I don't know if it was intimidating or if it's just that all of a sudden if you're up against people for an $80 million movie, everyone wants a man, I think the landscape is like constantly changing, and I feel like, thank God I'm living in the time that I'm living in right this instant, and not then. But I also think Shirley did a pretty incredible job of breaking ground. And in a way, as complicated and messy as her family life was, it's amazing that she found a position where she could write, and she was writing, and she was getting paid for her writing, and she was really the breadwinner of her household. So go Shirley for being way ahead of your time.
No, absolutely. And what I think is interesting too, is I just spoke with Sarah, and, she sort of talked about the collaborative spirit that you guys shared on this project. And I'm curious from your perspective going into this, was there, when you saw this script, was there anything in particular where you realize like, oh, we should sort of tweak that, or, was a lot of that sort of, the bones of the story and sort of the themes of it, are that already right there in place? I'm just curious from your perspective how sort of that experience was for you.
So much of the script I was completely in love with, which is one of the main reasons I wanted to join the project. And then, and then I also get excited about projects when I feel like I have something to add to them, and I think Sarah was so open to all my ideas and thoughts, and she was really incredibly collaborative. And a lot of the work that we did over the year between like me getting attached to the project and then us actually shooting was work, mostly on figuring out this Paula character, because Paula is this kind of for those who haven't seen the film yet, Shirley is writing a novel and she's trying to figure out this girl, Paula, who's going to be her main character, and she's a little stuck. And so I think that Paula kind of becomes a presence in the movie, almost like a haunting in a way. And I think figuring out how that worked and how that occurred and when she came up and how was something that I was really working on tracking, because I was kind of aware that this we really needed to understand this kind of ghost and connect with Shirley's relationship to her, and also what it meant for Shirley's relationship with Rose. So that was a lot of, I think, what we spent our time working on, and did a bit of tweaking of the ending. But Sarah is a genius. I mean, we had a great time playing. We just did a lot of playing. She's hilarious, as you found, you probably found when you talked to her. She's like, she's a superhuman, brilliant, creative visionary. So I feel like blessed that I got to spend any time with her and made a lot of boiled potatoes with that woman.
Your cast for this film is uniformly amazing. It very much is driven by Elisabeth and Odessa, but Michael and Logan are also pretty great too, although very frustrating.
Yes, right, of course, yes.
In a great way. But I would love to sort of talk about working particularly with Elisabeth and Odessa on their characters, because they are the heart of this movie and this journey that these two women are on together. Sort of, it's such a really interesting journey, especially for Rose, because it's almost, you can see the physical transformation that she undergoes throughout the film as well. And I was wondering if you talk about that and sort of peeling back the layers on Shirley and Rose in particular to sort of come up with this beautiful dynamic that, I mean, I just didn't want it to end. Like, I was really sad when this film was over.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for saying that. I had a great time. We had such incredible department heads really across the board. And I think the play that we got to do with kind of how the transformation of each of these women individually and sort of towards one another happened was very exciting. And I think our costume designer had some brilliant ideas in that realm and that are really realized in the film. And there were sort of these colors that we associated with each of the women. And then sort of, there were moments, the very important moments in the film when the color of one woman sort of like appears on the other woman. And that's, and so there was kind of this like shifting of worlds that happens throughout the film. And then I think, how these women are at the end versus how they are at the beginning is very telling for, what they have, the relationship that they've had to one another. So envisioning all of that and then seeing it come realized was extremely exciting. And also this was my first time to really have a large hair and makeup department. A period piece like really hinges on the hair of the woman. Right. And then we had this all girls school with so many women. So it was a pretty, our hair and makeup department really got slammed a few days. But it was also really exciting to just like look into how that can be such an exciting part of the storytelling of the whole film.
No, definitely. And I think what's also interesting too is, it's sort of going back to Shirley and Stanley's relationship. Because, there's parts of me that just like, I wanted to shake him sometimes because I was so angry because of how he would just push her in ways that, anybody who knows, like anybody who's dealing with mental health issues these days, I think obviously those fields have come around in large ways over the last 50 or so years, but just the way that he'd be like, no, she has to come to dinner. And the way that, sometimes it just almost felt dismissive, but yet what I liked about it was towards the end of the movie, you get a sense that there is a genuine affection between them, even though it's not conventional. And I'm curious for you, I mean, is it interesting to sort of, we see so many movies where you get like sort of the typical romances or the typical relationships, and this isn't that film at all. Was it interesting for you to kind of sort of examine those kind of relationships here and explore sort of the human side of them, because for somebody looking in from the outside, it doesn't seem like it would make sense. But I think the way that you sort of present it here, it does.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of that credit is to Sarah's script. And I remember our editor saying really well that, when we first started watching down the movie as a whole, he was just really excited. And he was saying, this is a film that says something different about being an artist and a human than most films. And he just kept saying, there's this realization that most characters in almost every film have, and it kind of leads to a fairly predictable ending. And he was saying how much he enjoyed that this film has something new to say about being an artist and about kind of what it takes and what you do to yourself and to others. And I think that I kudos to Sarah for being willing to let it be so complicated and for writing an ending that felt so complicated. And it gave, Lizzie has such an incredible performance at the end of this movie. I just fucking love this shot that stays on her for a long time towards the end of the film. And you really get inside of the journey that she's been on to be an artist and I think that's the moment that we all connect into to her world and to her, the kind of visceral, painful brilliance of her process.
No, definitely. And you mentioned your department heads, which everybody here did a phenomenal job. I mean, the production design of that house alone, like I wanted to pause it at certain moments just so I could like peek at the books that are sitting on shelves and the clutter and things like that. Because I think for me, that's what makes things feel like it's a real lived in place as opposed to like a set. And I love those kind of details. Can you talk about the difficulties and the challenges that you guys might have faced? Because, these days we're 40 years removed from the year 1980 now. So it's starting to get harder to do movies that seem sort of modern. And so like to take films this far back, were there any inherent challenges like you didn't necessarily anticipate, or was it, there's challenges with anything, I think at this point,
Yeah, there were definitely things that I hadn't, planned. The things that you realize that you're like, oh, right. Oh, I got it. Okay. When you do a period piece, it's very hard to shoot outside, anywhere outside, basically any direction. Especially for 1940s, if you don't have an enormous budget where you can kind of like outfit an entire city block to look like, it's 1940s, you just have to be really careful and thoughtful about how you use space. And so it was sort of lucky that Sarah had written this story to be mostly set inside of a house that, during Shirley's like agoraphobic period. So, but I think that, the outside spaces that's a big challenge, a huge challenge. I learned a lot about shooting a period movie during this.
That's excellent. When I was talking to Sarah, I'd asked her this question, and I want to ask you as well, because I feel like I'm always really interested in, sort of how creative endeavors sort of change people. And I'm a big believer, whether you're a writer, a director, actor, cinematographer, anything, when you put yourself out there creatively, obviously there's a piece of you that goes into that art that you're creating. But I also feel like there's a piece of it that you take with you. And looking at what you were able to do with Shirley and the things that you were able to create on this project, what was sort of your biggest takeaway from your experience working on this project?
Oh, wow. What a great question.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I think I think it maybe is don't be afraid to be yourself as an artist. This is my biggest project by far. This was, working with actors who are way more experienced than I am, frankly, and they're and extremely established and famous and with a bigger budget than I've had before. And I think what was really exciting and really wonderful about our financiers at LAMF and our producers is that they really let me have my vision for this film and to shoot it in the way that I wanted to shoot it and to edit in the way that I aim to edit it. And hopefully I hope that people really respond to it feeling really different. It's not your standard biopic. It doesn't feel like a movie that would have been shot. I always think if you're going to shoot a period movie now, don't make it look like it was shot in 1940. Like there's something you ideally you want to, there needs to be something about the present in the past. And I think the way that we shot this film is not how a movie would have been shot in 1940. Or for 1948 when our film is set. And so I feel really grateful that I was given that opportunity to pursue that vision. And then, but I was still terrified all the time and I was, messing things up or, but a lot of the things I'm most proud of in the movie are the times when I really, let myself be myself and let the process feel connected to the process that I had on other projects and the process that I was really interested in. And so I feel grateful that I got that opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, Josephine, it has been amazing to speak with you. And I was really excited because I know Mubi just sort of released their new library of stuff. And I saw that you have your own section on there, which is pretty awesome.
Oh, wow. That's so exciting. I didn't realize that. No,
yes.
I didn't know. I got to go on Mubi.
Yes, there's 3 films of yours I actually haven't seen. In art history, it actually come up in a conversation I'd had with Joe Swanberg. And so that one's on there. And that was my Mild and Lovely is on there, as well as Butter on the Latch. So, I think that's a sign that you've made it. If you get your own sort of streaming section, I think that's like the sign of like, hey, this is somebody we need to keep an eye out for. And I would agree.
I'm very excited. Well, that's awesome. I can't wait. I got to check that out. That's badass. Okay, good.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time today. And really, it's been a real pleasure for me. And congratulations on this film. It's absolutely incredible.
Well, thank you, Heather. Thanks so much again for talking to me about it.
You're very welcome. Thank you again.
And that's a wrap on this week's episode of Corpse Club, the official podcast for dailydead.com. A huge thank you to both Sarah Gubbins and Josephine Decker for joining us this week. And we hope you do check out Shirley now that it is playing on VOD and on Hulu as well. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And until next time, stay scary.